Dr. Richard Carrier, appreciate you taking questions from my patrons. Joel Pearson, who's a supporter of both of us. Christians often claim, he asks, that we have New Testament manuscripts from 125 AD. What methods are they using to get this date? How do those methods work? And how precise are they in reality?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. This is a great question because, in fact, you and I have just shot a whole series of lectures for one of the courses that I'm going to be doing with you. And one of them is on New Testament studies for beginners. Like how do you answer questions exactly about how do you answer questions like this on your own, right? Is what the course is about. And I have a whole section in there where I talk about exactly this. And one of the syllabi recommends Brent Nongbri's recent book, God's Library, which I think is one of the most important books that's been written on this very question. And what Nongbri does is he actually goes back and looks at the dating of all of these manuscripts and finds that the reasoning has been largely specious and a bit fudged. Like there's been a sort of need to push the dates as early as possible for apologetic reasons, for obvious reasons. And he says, but when you look at the methods objectively, that you don't get that result. And so what he finds is that, and it's not just him, right? He's actually part of a wave of scholars that are coming back and re-examining our dating of these manuscripts. So most of these manuscripts are being dated later now than they used to be. And you can find these debates. You can go on Wikipedia, there's a list of New Testament papyri, right? And papyri are the earliest manuscripts that we have. So look at list of New Testament papyri, and you can go item by item by item. And usually the Wikipedia article will have this, show the debate that, oh, it used to be dated 125. Now it's dated like maybe 200, right? So like you see like the way that's changing. And the way it's changing, the reason it's changing is because scholars are getting more objective and less fevered about how they're placing these manuscripts. Now the method they're using, and this is part of the reason why this has happened, the method they're using is extremely vague, right? It is not, you almost never get a manuscript that has a date on it, right? Like sometimes we do. We actually are some, like certainly medieval manuscripts that actually have, this was scribed at this date. Like sometimes we have that. Almost never have that. And certainly for papyri, the papyrological manuscripts, we don't have that. And one other thing I point out, by the way, is that when we're talking in the 2nd century AD, we're not talking about even whole books. We're talking about little scraps, like a few sentences. So when they say manuscript, we mean like 2 lines or something, right? Like, so these are not extensive New Testament manuscripts. But we have these little trash scraps, and they usually are trash scraps. They're usually found in the trash. So we dig through trash heaps because that's what archaeologists love, trash, because that's where you find everything about a culture is in their trash. It's the best place to dig. Anyway, so this is where you find a lot of these. And many of them are found by looters, of course. But they're probably found in the same kind of locations, essentially. They're looting these same sites. But they're dated by now scribal hand. So scribal styles of writing, the way that you write script, slowly changes over time as different styles are taught in school, right? So like you learn a style in school and then you teach that style, but you've modified it a little bit yourself, so you teach a slightly modified style. And then they learn that style, but then they modify it a little bit, and then they teach their slightly modified style. And so there's actually a clock that you can look at. It has a plus minus 50 years though, so this is very vague, right? This is not a precise dating method. And this is the point that Nongbri makes in God's Library. So if you really want the full science of this, like it's spot on, and he does a really good job of explaining why it has a plus minus 50 is as accurate as we can get. And it's that a lot of these, like the center dates on these, are closer to 200 than actually 125. And we really don't have any evidence of a manuscript that actually dates to 125 AD. There's a few manuscripts you could say that there's a low probability that they do, but it's not the peak of the probability. The peak probability puts it later usually. So all of this stuff has been dated later. That's the first argument I would say to them. Is like any Christian apologist who says that to you, he's like, well, that's been reconsidered. You should look at the latest scholarship on that. And then secondly, you should point out that that the dating method is not as precise. You can't say 125, right? Like that's just a number picked out of the air. This is really very vague dating, where we've got this whole 100-year span in which it could have been written. So you have to be much more loose in your dating. You'd have to say, at best, you could say 125 to 225, right? And that's less exciting for an apologist to say, because that's saying like, oh crap, it might be late. I don't know. And so that's the situation we're in. And we don't have anything that has dates that cross into the 1st century of scribal style. I don't think we have anything that dates even scribal style that would fit early 2nd century, really. Maybe there's a few, I don't know, but you have to read Nongri to find what his opinion is on this. But generally, that's how it's done now. It's not done. And carbon dating, by the way, is no more accurate. It's the same inaccuracy, plus minus 50 years at that date level. So carbon dating wouldn't help us. Carbon dating would only rule out forgeries. And even not even that all the time, because forgeries can be made on ancient papyrus. So that we don't really have any accurate dating methods. So this when they say 125, it's like that's a very, very optimistic and poorly supported date of a manuscript. Is the way I would answer that. And just point them to Nongbri's book, God's Library. It's a really high level, peer reviewed, excellent treatise on this very point.
I'm curious about applying that to Islam. I know this is outside of the question about the New Testament, but Stephen J. Shoemaker, who's written much on Mary in Christianity, he's also engaged in like the death of a prophet. He just came out with a publication. He's caught a lot of crap for it, arguing for the Quran being kind of a little later in the 7th century rather than it being something that Uthman and whatnot, like early on.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And that he might think that carbon dating could be later. And I haven't read the book. I don't know his reasonings, but he gets a lot.
I don't know about that specifically. What I do know about, because I was very interested in it and studied it, was the famous palimpsest that was just found. And the palimpsest, for people who don't know what that is when you have parchment or a papyrus and you get a pumice stone and you scrape the ink off and then write over it. But you can use techniques now with modern technology to recover the scraped off stuff. And that's called a palimpsest. So we find a hidden manuscript underneath an existing manuscript. And there's many examples of this, but the big prize was recently we found a Quran that has a text form that is closer to modern Quran that was composed. I can't remember when that was written down, but it's much later. But underneath it is another version of the Quran, which is unfortunately substantially different. It has a lot of variant readings. It does not agree with the modern Quran that gets published and sent around. But that underlying ink would presumably date to the time of the papyrus, or I think this was vellum, so I think it was animal skin rather than papyrus. But in any case, the date of the making of the material is probably pretty close to the date of the first ink on it. And so when that was carbon dated, it overlapped the date of when it was claimed to have been written, right? So like the range of dates, I think is like 100-year spans even before when we think the Quran was written, and then spans after. I can't remember the range of dates, how far later they go or whatever. And I think that's entirely plausible. So we might actually have like a really, really early version of the Quran that's very close to the original Quran. It's just that it is a variant reading text, so it doesn't agree with the modern Quran. I think that's the bigger problem with it, rather than the fact of dating it. As to the idea of trying to argue that the Quran was written down or invented, let's say the text was invented or written later, I don't know how one would prove that with the evidence that we have available. So, but like I said, I haven't read that book, so I can't.
Yeah, I haven't read it either, and I might be misinformed on even how I'm approaching this, but I'm just now getting into is the death of a prophet, and I'm interested in that because he is showing what we're doing in New Testament studies and how we're like ripping it apart. And I don't mean it in a derogatory sense. I mean like critically.
I know exactly what you mean.
Where he's saying like, if we approach those techniques and methodologies to the Quran, we got a bigger problem.
Yeah, there's been a lot of resistance to doing that. So a good example is the fact that I can go on Wikipedia and go list of New Testament papyri. The fact that I can go to the Swanson editions and find, line by line variant readings. I can go to the Allen text and find an apparatus that says all the variant readings. So there's meticulous, like massive amount of personnel time is spent on collating all these manuscripts, finding all the variant readings, and honestly admitting to them in the margins of critical editions. I'm not aware of this ever having really been done with the Quran, right? I think largely because no one really wants to know what will happen when you do this. And I think that's largely the reason. And partly also I think the Quranic studies is underfunded by the kinds of universities that would actually do this sort of work. But also the fact that the Quran, the manuscripts where you would look for them, are in places that are really not friendly to archaeologists, right? So we have a hard time finding these things. And also because of corrupt governments and poverty and things like that, libraries get looted, things disappear. So it's been harder to preserve manuscripts and have this large manuscript base for the Quran than we had for the New Testament. Now, I'm just touching the tip of the iceberg, and I'm not an expert in this, but I'm just talking about what I have seen and not seen in the field yet. And I haven't seen any kind of work that's comparable to the manuscript collation and critical edition that we do now with the New Testament, that being done with the Quran. I haven't seen that done yet. I'm not an expert in that field, though, so I can only speculate as to why that hasn't been done at this point. But I suspect it's for lack of access to information, really.
Yeah, I just hope we keep changing. Thank you for your wonderful question. And Dr. Carrier, I appreciate you. Be on the lookout for those courses when they come out. You're going to want to buy Enter Your Way In lifetime course. Multiple topics we'll be discussing, of course, and they will be in the description as they roll out. Thank you so much.